Hello 11 plus hopefuls, my name's James. I'm a tutor at 11plusprepschool.co.uk, an online tuition service for all your 11 plus tuition needs. Now today I'm going to be doing a video on poetry comprehension. I'm going to be doing a video on poetry comprehension because that is what you overwhelmingly asked for in response to a survey that we set up in conjunction with the 11 Plus Journey Facebook group. Overwhelmingly you chose poetry, I think quite reasonably, because poetry is on the surface something which is difficult to understand, and the objective of this session is to help you gain confidence with your abilities to analyze, interpret and comprehend a poem. So the poem that we're going to be looking at today is The Eagle by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's a nice bite-sized chunk of a poem. It has just the two stanzas, and each stanza has 3 lines each. My maths isn't great, but I make 2 stanzas each of 3 lines, 6 lines in total. So really not much to deal with at all. It has a very simple rhyme scheme as well. It has an AAA rhyme scheme, and all that means is that line 1 rhymes with line 2, which rhymes with line 3. As you can see there, we have hands, lands and stands in the first stanza. Okay. Now, how should we start comprehending a poem? Well, this might sound obvious, but students of mine often forget to do this. Students of mine will pay no regard to the title and launch straight in to the poem and start reading it. So my first bit of advice is pay attention to the title. It has information in it, information that may and will help to ground you. Okay, so the title of this poem is The Eagle, and we all know what an eagle is. It is a bird of prey. The next thing that we should pay attention to is the name of the author. Again, this is something that can be ignored. Shouldn't be ignored, but often it is in my experience. And the reason why it shouldn't be ignored is that the name of the author provides certain clues to us. And those clues might be, well, let's take Alfred Lord Tennyson as the example. He is a Victorian poet. If we know that, and hopefully some of us do know that, we can make certain inferences about his sensibilities, his concerns, the style in which he writes. And we can also make assumptions about what his poems will not be. So his poems will not be like a comparison of the PlayStation and the Xbox, because these were not things that existed in his time. Okay, so having paid attention to both the title and the author, we can then begin reading the poem. But before we do, I just want to mention something, and that something is the fact that students, I was going to say children, but all students of poems sometimes struggle with, especially with older poems where the convention is to begin each line with a word with a capital letter. So as you can see in this poem, all 6 of our lines begin with a word that is capitalized. So he, close, ringed, the, he, and. And I find that students often think of the end of the line of a poem as the equivalent to the end of a sentence, and that affects their reading, and having affected their reading affects their comprehension. So we can do a little cheat and just get rid of the capitals where, you know, in modern convention we wouldn't have them. So now what we see is only 2 capitalized words, the he of the first stanza and the of the second stanza. There are no other capitalized words in this poem. So it should become clear now that what we're working with is a poem of 2 sentences, and rather neatly, each sentence is equivalent to 1 stanza. Now, it's not always the case in poetry. It just so happens that it's the case with this poem. So all we're dealing with is 2 sentences. Put another way, a sentence is a unit of meaning, where we're dealing with just 2 units of meaning. So knowing that, hopefully we can go forward feeling quite confident about our ability to tackle this poem. Okay. So the first thing I want to teach you is what I call the paragraphing technique. And the paragraphing technique is a really quick, simple way of getting a high-level overview about a piece of text that you're comprehending. Now, I usually teach the paragraphing technique as part of fiction or non-fiction comprehension. By fiction, I'm excluding poetry from that for convenience sake. So say a student of mine is reading a comprehension piece, let's say it's 8 paragraphs long. I will say to them, write a one-word or one-phrase summary of each paragraph. Use the most essential word or the most essential phrase to summarize that paragraph. And once you've read through your extract of 8 paragraphs long, you'll have 8 words or 8 phrases, each of which conveys the essence of what that paragraph is about. Okay, what that means is that at the end of the text that you've read, you'll have 8 words that you use to comprehend the entire thing that you've just read, the entire text that you've just read. Okay, and we can do the same thing with this poem here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through this poem and then extract what I think is the most essential thing about each of the stanza. So I'm going to read this through first of all. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed with the azure world, he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. Okay, so let's just pause to think about that for a second. In the first verse, we have the eagle. He seems to be high up. He's close to the sun. He's ringed with the azure world. So I'd say the most essential phrase that we can use to describe this stanza is high up. Okay. Don't worry yet that I haven't gone into detail about what each of these lines means, or what particular words means, or what particular phrases in this poem mean. I will do that later. I just want to get a really kind of high-level overview for the time being. Okay. And the second stanza has the eagle falling. That's the most essential thing. Like a thunderbolt, he falls. So the word that I would use to summarize the second stanza is falls. So now we have a really, really high-level overview of what the poem is about. We can construct a narrative around those 2 words, or rather the one phrase and one word that we've used. We say, the eagle was high up, then the eagle fell. And that's it. We have understood the poem. We've understood the poem in a very superficial way, perhaps, but nonetheless we've understood what it is about mostly. So let's do a deeper analysis now that we know what that poem is essentially about. So the first thing that I want to point out is he. Now it may seem really obvious here who the he refers to. It refers to the eagle. But whenever I'm working with my students and we encounter a pronoun, I always get them to confirm they know who that pronoun or what that pronoun refers to. It will be surprising how often students do not know what noun a pronoun refers to. And it's understandable why, because a pronoun is a symbol of a symbol. So your name is a symbol of you. And a pronoun used in place of your name is a symbol that describes a symbol. So you can see where it's easy to lose the thread with pronouns. Here it's not so difficult. We should know that we're talking about the eagle. So he, the eagle, clasps the crag with crooked hands close to the sun. So straight away, we have quite noticeable alliteration. Now, I'm sure you all know what alliteration is, but it's a repeated sound. So we have, he clasps the crag with crooked hands close. So we've got 4 hard C sounds in succession. The important thing to remember about alliteration is it must have some kind of effect, or it should have some kind of effect. We shouldn't have alliteration for alliteration's sake. So I could say, for instance, we went to Wolverhampton last Wednesday. We could say that's alliteration because there's a few W's in there. But really, it's not alliteration in the sense that it doesn't have a literary effect. Okay. A poet who uses alliteration, if they're a skilled poet, and Tennyson indeed is, are alliterating for an effect. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the effect here? He clasps the crag with crooked hands close to the sun. Well, that hard C sound reinforces, to my mind, it reinforces the grasping of the eagle's talon on the rock on which he's perched. It may convey strength, that the eagle is strong, that these claws, his talons, are used for hunting. We encountered the word crag in that line. Now, whenever I'm going through a text with students and we come across a word that is commonly not known, we define it. And that is a sensible thing to do. Again, no matter what kind of text you're comprehending, if you come across a word you don't know, I mean, not in an exam, obviously, because you wouldn't be allowed to, but if you're doing, say, like a 10-minute test, and you come across a word you don't know, please pick up a dictionary, find out what it means. If it's a concrete noun, get a picture of it so that you can associate a picture with the sound, with the word. The reason why it's important to do this is whenever you're reading, what you're doing, or what you're, I hope, doing, is forming a mental movie of whatever you're reading. So, for example, you're reading a novel, and you will be reading the words and understanding them. And as you're reading the words and understanding them, especially the nouns and the verbs, they will be contributing to an accurate mental movie in your head, and you're always updating that movie with each new word that you encounter. To continue with this metaphor, if there's a word, say there's a noun or a verb that you don't know, then you're going to lose frames from that movie in your head, and it's going to affect your overall comprehension of that movie. So we have the word crag, and it's a word that a lot of students don't know, so we're going to define it here. A crag is a noun, and it means a steep or rugged cliff or rock face. And in the picture there you can see a craggy kind of outcrop, which should give you an idea of what a crag is and help you to picture what's going on in this poem. So our eagle is gripping the crag with his crooked hands. And then we have more alliteration here. Again, I don't believe this is accidental. I think it's intentional. We have lonely lands. The L's are followed by long vowel sounds, which has a different effect to the effect given by the hard C's of clasps the crag with crooked hands close to the sun. And to my mind, it feels like a relaxation. He clasped the crag with crooked hands close to the sun in lonely lands. That might just be my imagination, but that will tie in to an interpretation of this poem's meaning that I'm going to give later on. So I feel like the lonely lands might be a sort of relaxation of the eagle's grip, or another interpretation might be that it emphasizes a feeling of longing. Just read those two words to yourselves. Lonely lands. Lonely lands. It has a kind of musicality about it, and a kind of sorrowful or wistful musicality, I believe. Okay, so we'll come back to that a bit later. Actually, no, we won't. I want to stay on Lonely Lands. Why do I want to stay on Lonely Lands? Well, okay. So the eagle is high up, he's close to the sun. That's what we mean by saying the eagle is close to the sun. It's a more poetic way of saying he was high up. Okay, so the lands beneath him are described as lonely, which we can imagine to be a barren landscape or a very bare sea. We can also read this as a pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is when you attribute or transfer human feeling to something inanimate. So it might not be the lands which are lonely. We might be transferring loneliness from something else to the lands. Now, what is the something else? The something else would be the eagle. Are we transferring, or is the poet transferring the eagle's loneliness to the lands below? And I should just say that I don't think this violates any rules of pathetic fallacy or personification. I think it's there's no harm in saying that animals feel some of the emotions that humans feel. Animals feel lonely, so I think it's fine to assume that maybe this eagle has this very human emotion of loneliness, which is not so uniquely human if animals feel it too, and I'm sure they do. So we could assume that the loneliness does not belong to the land, rather to the eagle. And if we assume that, we can then ask, well, what kinds of loneliness are there? Because there's loneliness when you're in want of a friend, and that's not a very nice kind of loneliness. But there's also the other form of loneliness, or another form of loneliness, which is the loneliness of a ruler. Because this eagle here, he's close to the sun. Okay, he's high up. He surveys the land below him. He's in an elevated position. And if we take the word monarch, meaning ruler, or we call our current king Charles, he is our monarch. A monarch is of Greek origin, and it means one who rules alone. So we could be attributing kind of kingly qualities to the eagle. Now, just stopping on monarch for a minute, words that begin with M-O-N and are of Greco-Latin origin can often mean one or alone. So monotone means one tone. Monochrome means one color. Monolith means, I think, one stone. Just teaching you here about the origins of words, etymology can be a very useful skill to have. Anyway, that's a side issue. So our eagle could be lonely, and it could be lonely in a couple of ways. It could be lonely in a kind of I have no companions kind of way, or it could be lonely in a kind of elevated regal sense, that he is the sole ruler of all he surveys. Anyway, I just want to hop back to hands for a moment or two. And the reason why I want to go back to hands is I think there are dangers of analysing poetry. So before I did this session, I read other people's analyses of this poem to see how much they chimed with mine. And one thing that I did read was someone said in their analysis that the use of the word hands is deliberate to give the eagle human qualities, so anthropomorphic qualities. I disagree with that. I think we should go for the simpler explanation here, that even though an eagle does not literally have hands, we shouldn't derive any kind of metaphorical reason from the use of the word hands here. We shouldn't derive any kind of metaphorical currency from it. The reason being is I mean, what else could Tennyson have used here? Because clearly this is a poem that has a regular rhyme scheme. It also has a meter as well. And if we were to replace hands with the more accurate word talons, then we would throw our rhyme scheme and our meter into jeopardy, because it will read like this: he clasped the crag with crooked talons, close to the sun in lonely lands. And you can see there now it doesn't read so well. So I think that the poet has used the word hands here as a convenience, expediently. Okay, it's not the most accurate word, but it's the word that makes most sense while preserving the rhyme scheme and preserving the meter of the poem. And by meter, I mean the rhythm of the poem, the dum, da dum, da dum, da dum. Okay. So the next thing I want to look at is the next line. Or rather, not the next line, because I just skipped back to hands, but you know what I mean. So we got ringed with the azure world he stands. What does ringed with the azure world mean exactly? Well, first of all, let's look at the word ringed and ask, why is it written like this? Why is it written R-I-N-G''D? Well, in Tennyson's day, verbs such as ringed could be spelled either R-I-N-G''D or R-I-N-G-E-D, as we would spell it today. And they would have different pronunciations. So as it's written on the screen before you, it's pronounced ringed. If it was written ed, it'll be pronounced ringed. Okay? The reason why Tennyson has used ringed and not ringed is because, again, using ringed preserves the meter, the rhythm of the poem, whereas ringed would throw it off kilter a bit. So that's why some verbs in poems, especially older poems, will have this elision. It's called an elision, where a letter is missed out, it's elided. Okay, so we've turned a two-syllable verb into a single-syllable verb. Okay, next we've got the word azure. And azure is an unusual word, or perhaps it isn't an unusual word, because rather spookily, I have read so many creative writing pieces from children where they use the word azure. I mean, it's uncanny the amount of times that this word gets used. So I don't know if 11 plus students all share some kind of collective mind and the word azure is in there, and they kind of channel that word into their creative writing as part of the course. But in case you don't know what azure means, well, it's an adjective which means the blue of a clear sky. It's the colour you see on the screen before you. Now, again, if you encounter unusual words, just like with when we talked about monarch, even though monarch isn't in the poem, I talked about how to deconstruct words according to elements of the word that we know, such as the mon in monarch, being the same as other words with mon in them, such as monotone or monochrome. Azure. If we don't know what this means, we can wonder: do we know any words which are similar to azure, which can give us a clue to the meaning? So, if any of you speak Spanish, for example, you might know the word azul, which is blue in Spanish. If any of you are football fans and like international football, and in particular like the Italian football team, you may know that they're called the Azzurri, or the Blue, because they play in blue. There is a place called the Côte d'Azur in France, just means the blue coast. It's the French Riviera. And for those of you who play Minecraft, you'll know there's a block called lapis lazuli. And if you look at the word lazuli, you can see AZU in that, which is the AZU, which also features in azure. Lapis lazuli is blue stone. Okay, so now we know what azure means. And if you're ringed with the azure world, a ring is a circle, it simply means that you're circled by the azure world, or you're encompassed within the azure world. So the azure world is the sky. So this image reinforces the idea that this eagle is high up, that he's alone, that he surveys much around him. And then we get onto my favourite part of the poem. It's this image here, the wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. This is a fantastic image. This is a brilliant. So if any of you have creative writing aspirations, one thing that you really would benefit from is originality. So when you use an image, try and make that image original. I think a problem with a lot of older poetry is that because it's been around for so long, the images become quite overfamiliar to us and they no longer have the power. But this image still strikes me as being incredibly fresh even after all these years. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. It's a fantastic image, and it does quite a lot. So why is the adjective wrinkled used to describe the sea? Well, first of all, the eagle's high up. So what he sees below him in the waters below is very small. So it reinforces the impression that the eagle is really high up. Secondly, it conveys to us that the sea is probably calm, okay? Because the waves, even if they were, despite the eagle being high up, if the waves were big, then wrinkle would not be the appropriate adjective. The waves must be relatively small and calm and slow moving. So slow moving, in fact, they could be not mistaken for wrinkles on the skin, but they're so similar to wrinkles on the skin because they're more like creases than things which are in motion. Okay, so it's a great image. Is there any metaphorical weight to this? Yes, there is, I would say. But before I get on to that, I've realised I've made a point about anastrophe. So anastrophe is when the normal order of words is changed, and it's quite common in poetry to employ anastrophe. So you may be wondering, what does the wrinkled sea beneath him crawls actually mean? Well, it means the same thing as the wrinkled sea crawls beneath him. We've just switched some of the words around to preserve the metre of the poem, the rhythm of the poem. Okay. So don't let things like that bamboozle you. If you see an oddly structured sentence, just say to yourself, it's probably oddly structured, or not even sentence, because this isn't a sentence, but if you see something which is oddly structured, ask yourself, is the poet employing anastrophe so as to preserve the rhythm of the poem? And knowing that poets sometimes do that will allow you just to switch words around mentally in your head to render that bit of the poem easier to read, if less poetic. So the wrinkled sea crawls beneath him, him being the eagle. So let's talk about what this might mean now. Wrinkled sea is a powerful original image, as I've said already. If we view the sea from high up, okay, I'm repeating myself here, but is it more than just a powerful image? Well, let's pair it with crooked hands. We've got wrinkled sea and we've got crooked hands. Now, crookedness and wrinkles are features associated with old age. In isolation, both crooked hands and wrinkled sea might not be much that we can take away from. After all, a eagle's talons are crooked. If you've seen that their talons, they're quite wrinkly and crooked. But we also have the wrinkled sea. Why wrinkled sea? Yes, wrinkled is a great image, but it's also, as I say, something associated with old age. So we've got two words associated with old age. People often in old age become crooked. Their backs become crooked, their limbs become crooked, and they most certainly become wrinkled. So are these words planting into our subconsciousness the idea that this eagle is aging? I don't know. It could be. I have a theory, which I'll go on to a bit later. But next we have, he watches from his mountain walls. Okay, so the image of mountain walls suggests that the mountain is almost vertical, and that's why we use the word walls there. So there's a risk that we might take this too literally and think of literal walls. What the poet means here is the mountains are sheer, like they're a sheer drop, near vertical as vertical can be. And the eagle is watching from it, and watching sounds like a very kind of deliberate act. And that's an important word that I want to discuss in a minute as well. But we come to the central question, what I believe is the central question about these last two lines, when the eagle falls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. The question is, does he hunt or does he die? And this is where the poem is open to interpretation. So I just mentioned the word watches. Watches sounds very deliberate. It's not as though the poet uses the word. Glances, perhaps. He doesn't describe the eagle as being sleepy-eyed, perhaps. This eagle is probably alert. He's watching. He watches from his mountain walls. And then like a thunderbolt, he falls. Like a thunderbolt is an interesting simile. A simile is a metaphor that uses as or like to make a comparison. And it's an interesting simile because it has two interpretations, because a thunderbolt has two properties. Two important properties in as much as this interpretation is concerned. And those two properties are power and direction. So are we saying that the eagle is like a thunderbolt in power or in direction? If first we go with power, the power of a thunderbolt, if it strikes you, is enough to kill you. Are we saying that the eagle watches purposely from his mountain walls and then falls down to the wrinkled sea in order to kill his prey maybe being a cod or a salmon or some kind of fish in the waters anyway? Or do we mean that the eagle is falling in the direction of a thunderbolt? Now, thunderbolts go in a downward direction. The thing about a thunderbolt is it takes the path of least resistance, so it takes the easiest path from the heavens to the earth. And while a thunderbolt doesn't have to go directly in a straight line from the heavens to the earth, and indeed in the picture on your screen you'll see it's quite jagged as it makes its way to the earth, it nonetheless is quite direct in its trajectory. So are we saying that the eagle is dropping? Is it that he has died and has fallen? Well, remember we talked about the wrinkled sea and crooked hands. Remember we talked about him clasping the crag with crooked hands close to the sun, that kind of hard gripping sound. And then I said it feels like a relaxation with the alliteration lonely lands, maybe a relaxation of that grip. Maybe the eagle is losing power. I don't know. Maybe he's getting old, wrinkled and crooked. I don't know. But this verb falls lends credence to the idea that he might have died. Now, you may say to me, James, earlier on you said the poet used hands as a matter of convenience. It's not the most accurate word, but it's the most accurate word that preserves the rhyme and the meter of the poem. So has the poet simply just not used falls to preserve the rhyme with crawls and walls and to preserve the metre of the poem? Now I'd say at this point of the poem, the end, the final word, it's more critical to be exact about what you want to convey. So we can forgive a bit of looseness at the beginning of the poem, at the non-critical part, if you like, but here at the end, surely it would make sense if we could to use a more accurate word. I mean, even if it meant altering the rhyme scheme that the words that come before it so that it rhymes perhaps with swoops or glides. But we don't have swoops or glides, we have falls. And that is a very passive word which sits quite uneasily with the very active word watches, which makes me think there's two interpretations here. There may be more than two, but I think there are two competing ones. Hunting or dying. I've also wondered whether those two competing interpretations of the poem can't actually be wedded together. So why not the eagle is intending to hunt? He clasps the crag with crooked hands, as he always has done at this time of day, close to the sun. He studies the wrinkled sea, looking for something to swoop down and catch. He watches purposefully, but he is dying. Animals don't have a concept of death. He wouldn't be aware that he's dying. He'll be going about his routine as usual, or trying to. Hence the purposefulness of his watching from his mountain walls. And at the moment when otherwise he would have swooped down into the sea to catch his prey, he instead falls, which would give this poem a quite ironic ending. So I don't know if that is ultimately the meaning that Tennyson wants us to take away. I think so long as you have an interpretation of the poem which stands up to scrutiny, you're on safe grounds. What I mean is don't read a poem and then half-bake some theory about what the poem's about. If you use evidence from the poem, if you can back up your assertions with that evidence, then your interpretation is on solid ground. But I hope I've demonstrated there that interpreting a poem is not that difficult, and you can come away with a coherent interpretation of what that poem is about. Indeed, you can come away with more than one interpretation of what that poem is about. So remember as well that you can do the high-level overview of the poem before you go into the deeper interpretation, the deeper analysis of it. So remember, our high-level overview was eagle is high up, eagle falls. That's a very simplistic understanding, but it's not wrong. And that gives you a basis on which to perform your deeper analysis and start to look for perhaps the hidden meanings in the poems, the interesting uses of language and what they suggest, what they convey. Okay, so I am going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it there because I recorded this video yesterday and it was quite long, so I hope this is shorter. And I recorded this video again earlier before I did this recording, and Alexa thought I called her name and started speaking and interrupted the recording. So before any technological mishaps can happen with Alexa again, I'm going to end the lesson here, or end the video here. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful. I'll be releasing more videos in the coming weeks. I hope to do live videos as well as, or instead of recorded videos. It just leaves me to say thank you very much, and I hope to see you again. And if indeed you do need tuition, I tutor for 11plusprepschool.co.uk. We can be contacted at that address, or we can be contacted on 07736 252 419 by phone call, text message, or WhatsApp message. Okay, thank you very much, and see you soon.